with a lot of Muslim students, I've never met one who doesn't loathe and fear Islamic State, and some of them are recent arrivals in Australia. Now, every counterinsurgency expert, even the most conservative, including David Kilcullen, an Australian, says that Islamic State is a result of the US wars in the Middle East, the spawn of the US wars in the Middle East. Now, these genocidal wars of aggression would not be possible without the radicalisation of Western youth. In particular, I'm thinking of American youth, and having spoken to a couple of members of US veterans against the war, one of whom was recruited in high school at the age of 17, filled full of lies, sent to Iraq in 2 tours of duty, and was told that soldiers in general were told they had to get their first kill. He spoke of one soldier who just murdered a guy riding past on a bicycle. So the process seems to be to dehumanise the soldiers and demonise the so-called enemy. Now, how do we expect to de-radicalise the very few youth and people in general who do perpetrate acts of terrorism in the West, when our whole society, to some extent, the majority of our society and our youth are radicalised into accepting that it's okay for the US to go and bomb the shit out of any country it likes, including Obama's mass murdering drone strikes in 7 countries.
I entirely agree with you. In fact, I would go one step further and say it's not just that we live in radicalised societies, but that we actually live in profoundly violent societies. I think we do have a level of objective violence that goes on that is unseen, including imperial wars and aggressions, but also terror and violence that goes on in domestic contexts, like in domestic violence. If we define terrorism as using violence to uphold an ideology, then that would include imperial wars of violence, as well as men who perpetuate domestic violence as a way of maintaining patriarchy. So I do think violence marks our society, and I do think the half-truth, the dangerous half-truth of al-Baghdadi and ISIS is that they point that out very clearly, the hypocrisy of Western states to label certain things as terrorism and other things as not. And I think I tried to make that point very briefly though. But you're absolutely right. In fact, without going too much into it, the genesis of ISIS was from the Iraqi insurgency, and a response, and the Sunni character that it took on was very much a response to the US propping up Nouri al-Maliki, who exploited sectarian tensions in Iraq. And you're absolutely right about drone strikes and other forms of violence. But I do think if we're going to talk about violence and violent extremism, we should look at our society as well, and look at the forms of violence that we perpetuate that we don't think about and don't see. So in that sense, I'm resolutely anti-violence.
Do you agree with the proposition, I'm sure you do, that the dogmatic adherence by governments across the world to the theological scholasticism of a fundamentalist neoliberalism, with its policies of austerity and laissez-faire market economics, along with political factors like the destruction of Iraq, 2003 invasion, is the catalyst for religious fundamentalism, radicalisation and terrorism? In other words, that radicalisation can only be effectively dealt with, prevented, if understood as stemming from social disaffection and alienation, from those who are marginalised, disenfranchised, the victims of entrenched social injustice and inequality.
The blind commitment to the so-called free market was a rejection of a commitment to the public sector. It was the notion that it was what used to be called social Darwinism, the survival of the fittest, a kind of social and economic free-for-all in which was the means of growing massive social inequality. Those forms of policies, I agree with you, are an expression of violence. The idea that you are actually only a commodity, whether you're a student, a patient, or a welfare recipient, it's only worth having a conversation with you if there's a dollar sign at the end of it. I mean, for example, the University of Sydney is a giant corporation. It's been hijacked by the corporate sector. So the commodification of everybody and everything, I think that's okay for second-hand cars on the Prince's Highway, but not for the conduct of social relationships. There's also a more sinister dimension to the answer, and that concerns the international trade in arms. Because part of the free-for-all is, and this is Prime Minister Turnbull's concern with innovation. The innovation, what are they doing? They're all rushing off to Israel and America. And what are the prime means of innovation in those countries? They're linked to the army. They're about surveillance. They're about policing. They are about, in our case, part of the neoliberalism is to pay G4S and Transfield millions of dollars to control the most vulnerable people in the world on Manus Island and Nauru. In other words, we've given away the responsibility of government. And the absurd Turnbull, when he was rejected by the premiers this week that you can't raise your own income taxes in Glebe, I thought you'd like that. Then he said, don't come cap in hand to me, meaning the responsibilities of government are of no consequence. I mean, that's what Milton Friedman taught Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. He said it should be a free-for-all. You should get rid of people.
No such thing as society.
No such thing as society. And Mrs. Thatcher was known as, this is the dogma that you refer to, she was known as Tina. There is no alternative.
I think one of the dangerous things about what we call neoliberalism is that politics doesn't exist in neoliberalism. So even voting is about the aggregation of votes, appealing to tastes and so on. So I think politics doesn't exist, and I think it's really dangerous. But I would be hesitant to say that there is a causality between neoliberalism and the violent reactions to it. But there's definitely, it's a condition. I would say it's definitely there.
The radicalization of youth still continues. You hear stories of Monies in the Lim Cafe or the 15-year-old kid. Isn't that still a mental health issue? But why is not picked up by society and we perpetuate that whole blaming game?
For every one student we were talking to about the mental health of everybody, there were 50 students studying commerce. There were 100 studying econometrics. There were 200 studying commercial law. Right? So where the issue of the values that were inferred by your question were of no consequence. Almost none of those students knew anything about human rights. Even the law faculties, really, human rights was regarded on the curriculum as really insufficiently remunerative. So that's partly why the kind of mental health issues that you refer to are kind of leftover. The other thing I'd say that I picked up from your question is that some of the dangerous fundamentalisms are not from young people. They're from places like the Institute of Public Affairs. It's an organisation that puts people like Tim Wilson into the Parliament or gives him $400,000 a year to be a human rights commissioner when he knew nothing about human rights. So there's a kind of vandalism from the elite which is as dangerous, if in some ways more dangerous, than the threat from radicalised young people.
I was interested in the use of language tonight too, where cohesion. What's the other word? Inclusion. And inclusion. The way inclusion's one and a good example. It's thrown around and used in all sorts of ways, and I often cannot discern what is meant when the word is used. But the sorts of conversations I'd like you to talk about are both in school, then from school through to places like politics in the pub.
There was a researcher years ago, Richard Hogarth. He wrote a book about limited and extended language codes. And it came from a book called The Uses of Literacy. The literacy that we all have, take for granted, depends a fair bit on the books you have at home, the magazines and newspapers you read, the radio programs you listen to, or the television. So the extended the extended language code gave people a certain versatility in solving problems. The limited language code gave no versatility, limited the ability to solve problems. In that study, of course, because it was British, it was very class-based. It was very social class-based. But I do experience the little time, the less time set aside to say, tell me about yourself. What do you want to do? What's your real interest? How do you think you're going to get there? I am against efficiency. I am totally against efficiency. I wrote a book about against efficiency because we keep on hearing about efficiency as though the bottom line of the corporation is what should affect the way we conduct society and relationships. But efficiency means a sort of anal preoccupation with cost effectiveness in which there is no time for conversation. It's regarded as a waste of time until, it's interesting, goes back to Lim's question, until there's a crisis. I mean, I've met lots of professors at the university who were very successful and were in such a hurry that they never had time to talk to anybody because they were putting their name in lights until they opened their shirts and showed me the scar down the middle of their sternum where they'd had open heart surgery. At that point, they wanted to have a conversation. I think I better say, you won't have time to have a conversation.
The atrocities that have happened in Europe, having watched them, having palpably experienced them in London, Madrid, recently Paris, Belgium, what is your honest opinion that we can stop perhaps this inevitable, if it is or not, from happening?
We don't need to keep spending a fortune on the military and policing and drones and cameras and every form of surveillance, because that's not what gives us a sense of security. Look, there are three instruments which carry the aspirations of all people, and I wish the Australian politicians and leaders would talk about it more often. One is the Geneva Convention and all that went into it. The other is the rules of international law that prop up the Geneva Convention. And the other is the 30 clauses of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I mean, that was regarded as the greatest document of the 20th century. Most people don't have a clue about it. Or in this case, we just deride it, or we ignore it if it's inconvenient for the money we want to give to Transfield or G4S. And I have a great enthusiasm for that. It's about, the alternative is about great poetry. It's about a different kind of sovereignty. We keep on hearing about sovereignty as though it's about protecting our borders. There should be a sovereignty of great music, of great poetry, of great dance, of great art, of great literature, and of great beer. So that gives you a whole chemistry of life. You know, the way you dress, the hospitality you give to people, the way you cook food, the way you decorate your home. I mean, nobody on their deathbed says, I wish I'd spent more time at the office.
I have a question, and it's a very real question facing Sydney, Western Sydney public school teachers. At the moment, the federal and state government have allocated $55 million and they're financing flying squads coming into the schools. And the teachers are expected to dob in any antisocial behaviour any radicalised tendencies of their students. It's extremely divisive, very misguided. The money could be much better spent on a million other projects. And I just wondered if the panel's got any advice for Western Sydney public school teachers trying to hold the line.
Yes, so the flying squads are called specialist support teams. That was in the government's counter-terrorism plan. Basically, the idea is that if a staff member notices a young person behaving weird, i.e. most young people, i.e. me, most days, as my colleagues will tell you. Basically, the idea is that if a student starts to exhibit certain types of behaviours, you would call this hotline, and there'll be a team of people made up of psychologists and social workers who will extract the student from the school. If we're going to talk about alienation, I think one of the dangerous things is to rob young people of the very spaces where they should be allowed to express political disaffection and anger and a desire to want to change society. Now, if we turn schools into spaces where we're just spaces of surveillance, spaces where we're just there to pathologize young people, to criminalize them, then we rob society of yet another space where young people can do that. And the consequences of doing that, I think, are quite severe for our society. So I think the idea of specialist support teams is just a symptom of a greater problem, which is what we're trying to do with schools, which is to turn them into machines for surveillance of young people. I don't think that's what education should be about. And so I agree with you entirely that it's a very dangerous precedent.
I noticed that Canada is missing from the conversation. You mentioned US, UK, but not Canada. And so I'm just asking both speakers, what do you think of the rhetoric of Pierre Trudeau and Justin Trudeau? Because I think the rhetoric represents an alternative. Thank you.
My understanding is that Justin Trudeau, the son of Pierre, is a breath of fresh air compared to the neoliberal, almost fascistic behaviour of Stephen Harper, the previous Premier. And the fact that in terms of talking about human rights and the response to the environmental crisis, it was obvious that there was huge rapport between Obama and Justin Trudeau was just reassuring.
In an interview, I think just after the Chinese Revolution, I think it was Zhou Enlai, I think an interviewer asked him, what do you think about the French Revolution? And he said, it's too early to tell. I'll say that for Justin Trudeau.
Okay, thank you for those questions.